Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Behavior Beacon newsletter number 10. Today, we're going to be talking about behavior chaining. Before we begin, I am Marissa Eck.
I'm Jimmy O'Brien.
And I'm Aisha Lee.
We wanted to kick off this week's newsletter with a little quote from our favorite guy, Albert Einstein. And that quote is, "Out of complexity, find simplicity," which really follows the theme of this newsletter, where we're talking about how we link the simple to complex with behavior chains. So in our last newsletter, we discussed shaping, which is moving a behavior from a starting point to an end point using those closer approximations. The idea was taking one behavior and molding it into a behavior of relevance for a learner. But if you step away from it and think about all the things that we do every day in life, it doesn't involve just one behavior, right? It's a series of behaviors. Much of the things that we take for granted but do on a daily basis involve small, little, all intricately tied behaviors together that form links in a behavior chain. Think about the things that you do every day that involve a multitude of those tinier behaviors. Everything we do involves smaller behaviors that are linked together for a final outcome. We could review an exhaustive list of all the things that we do every day, but here are some common examples. Going to the bathroom, taking a shower, getting dressed, making coffee, brushing your teeth, and that's all before you leave your house. Of those skills, most people don't realize all of the behaviors that make them up. So, welcome to the Behavior Beacon number 10, behavior chaining, where we are now going to discuss linking simple behaviors to complex behaviors.
All right, guys. So what is behavior chaining? Chaining refers to a method of teaching a sequence of multiple behaviors that are linked to form an overall repertoire or skill. For example, washing your hands is a general skill, but when you break it down, the steps to washing your hands could be about 10 different behaviors or more. When you need to wash your hands, what do? So here's Jimmy with an in-depth analysis of breaking down hand washing.
Oh, I appreciate the in-depth. Just hold it there for a second. So excuse me. So if you see that little image we put there, it's like, it's a nice little image of chains. And in it, we have, what it potentially will look like for washing hands. So we have turn on the sink, wet your hands, get the soap, wash your hands, turn off the sink, dry hands. Those are the ones that we've kind of identified, and we'll get into how you identify those particular skills. So on its surface, right, it seems to make sense. Each one of those behaviors are intricately linked to form a more complex skill, although some people might say washing your hands isn't complex. But when you do a more in-depth analysis, looking at the antecedent, the behavior, and consequence, remember we keep coming back to that basic unit. When we started these newsletters, the first thing we talked about is that behavior is the things that people say and do, and it's composed of an antecedent and a consequence. So now when we're doing that in-depth analysis, you have an antecedent, a behavior, consequence. You can see how these simple chains when broken down, are much more complex, right? So let's take that chain there that we have on the top, and now we're going to do a little bit more in-depth analysis and blow it out so we can explain the conceptual analysis of what we mean by chains. Okay, so just think about the whole idea of washing your hands. Each one of those behaviors of turning on the faucet, wetting your hands, washing your hands, turning off the water and dry hands, those are the behaviors, right? And those are easy. But each one of those behaviors will both have an antecedent and a consequence. And even trickier, the consequences will also become the antecedents for the next behavior. What? What did I just say? Okay, so let me kind of work you through it so you kind of get the general idea of how each thing is intricately linked. I like using my hands a lot. I don't care. Okay, so let's say, for example, you tell your learner to wash, they're in front of the sink, and you say, wash your hands. Now there's your first antecedent, which should now evoke or bring out turning on the faucet, right? Once the faucet is turned on, well, what's the consequence for turning on the faucet? Well, it's the water running, right? Now there's your first kind of chain. Now the water running, as it is the consequence, now if you go to the next line, becomes the antecedent for the next behavior, which is placing their hands under the faucet to get wet. Placing their hands under the faucet to get wet, the consequence is your hands now are wet. which is the consequence for that previous behavior. But now your hands wet serves as the antecedent in the next step of the chain, which is getting the soap, right? Getting the soap. What's the consequence of getting the soap? You have soap on your hands, which becomes the consequence. But now if you go to the next line, note the soap in your hands now becomes the antecedent for the next behavior, which is washing, and so on and so on. So as you can see, if we were just to identify the behaviors, it seems very simple. But when you blow it out a little bit, you can see how things are very complex. And that's what we mean by these behavior chains. They're intricately linked together because the consequence becomes the antecedent for the next one. Okay. So that's what I was just going on. When all these things are linked together, we call that a behavior chain. So what seems very simple is actually quite complex when you put it under a microscope.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the conceptual analysis of it. Now we can get a little bit more into the general training process, which is going to involve a few things, right? It's going to involve how do we determine what's important for the learner? We'll talk about essential and functional and activities of daily living. The next one is that we'll talk about is how do you then identify what just are those steps that go into what we would call the skills. So if it's hand washing, if it's going to the bathroom, what are those skills? Are those behaviors or skills too? The third one then is what teaching methodology do you want to use? Do you want to teach from the beginning? Do you want to teach from the end? Or do you want to teach it all together? And then we'll finish it up with some tips of the week. Okay. So I just wanted to paint that conceptual picture. So how do you determine what's important for your learner? So what's important for your learner might be different for each learner, but we think there's a shared commonality about determining what might be important. So we believe those skills the ones that meet your biological health, safety, and autonomy are in our humble opinions, what constitutes what probably most important for the learner. We would consider those essential or functional skills, life skills, if you will. So more specifically, there's those skills that are crucial and effective for daily living. And we believe as a result will improve the quality of life. Moreover, we think, these essential skills are skills that are required every day by us in a multitude of different environments. And more importantly, that if the learner can't do it for themselves, then someone will have to do it for them. So those are kind of our general criteria. That criteria will be different based upon your learner, but those for us are the essential skills, or otherwise known as activities of daily living. So some of the more common ones, if I was to create circles around myself, concentric circles, think about all the ones that meet my biological needs, right? Feeding, dressing, eating. Eating and feeding are the same thing. Going to the bathroom. Those are the things that are going to be most important. We think those are the ones that should be the must-have skills. Those that will lead to greater autonomy, greater independence, and opening the environment for people. Because if we have to do it for our learners, it's a missed opportunity. They can do it for themselves.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so now we're going to chat about what is a task analysis, because that sounds like a weird word to apply to your children. So really what it is a breaking down of a complex skill or series of behaviors into those small teachable units. The product of a task analysis is a series of sequential steps. So you can determine your own task analysis in a variety of ways. You can watch someone else complete that task. An example of that is Jimmy and Aisha and I were writing a task analysis for hand washing a few months ago, and we all did it differently. So
mine was definitely the best. Mine was the best.
Mine's was undoubtedly the best. But we all were like, wow, okay, so we wouldn't have written the same one for the same task. So we had to kind of take stock of what would be the most common type of bathroom chain, and then put our heads together to determine the task analysis. Another form of this is asking someone who might be really good or skilled at a certain task. Hopefully, having been where we are for the last few months, we're all really good at washing our hands. And if all else fails, just perform it yourself and keep stock of the steps that you took to perform the task. Depending on your learner, some of these task analyses can range from very general into very specific. As you can see in the visual here, you have a simple task analysis for washing hands, which looks just like going to the bathroom, washing hands, dry hands, leaves the bathroom. But there might be some learners where we need to break it down into more of those sequential steps. So here we have goes to bathroom, goes to sink, turns on water, wets hands, gets soap, rubs hands together, rinses hands, turns off water, dries hands, and leaves the bathroom. Once you have your determined steps in your task analysis, you then can decide the way you would like to teach it. All right. Oh, there's another thing that's really important for us to mention is that something to take note of is where those skills that you're targeting are going to take place. So what we call that is generalization. So we want to know if our kiddos are going to be performing it at the same sink every day, or is it going to be at a variety of different sinks? Because some sinks have a soap dispenser that looks like this, or some have it, you have to put your hands under it, or some sinks are automated and others where you turn the faucet. So always thinking about those things, and ideally we want to teach our learners in a variety of settings with a variety of different stimuli and not just teach them how to do it with one sink as an example. All right, Jimmy, go for it.
So we talked about areas of importance, why it might be important. We kind of discussed the task analysis. Now, the last thing is, what would be your methodology for teaching it? So when in behavior analysis, there are 3 general methods for teaching a behavior chain. And they are, globally, you can teach from the beginning of the sequence, you could teach from the end of the sequence and work backwards, or you can teach all the behaviors of the list all at the same time. So let me just kind of go over it very briefly, because this is a newsletter. We can't go too much in-depth analysis about it, or the rationales, like why one would be chosen over the other. It typically deals with challenging behavior. But for the most part, the research out there is kind of 50-50, and what it really suggests is whatever's best for your learner. And the comfortability of the method that you use is really the independent variable. Although there's a few things that point, but that's beyond the scope of this newsletter. Okay, so the first one we would talk about is called a forward chain. So what is a forward chain? It's kind of what you think it might be. It's where you teach the very first skill to the learner, and then you do the rest. As the learner gets competent or meets criteria, let's say 3 consecutive times independently, you would then chain the 2 in together. So it would be 1, the first skill, and then the second skill. As the learner becomes competent in skills 1 and 2, you then build in 3, and then 4, as you move all the way down the chain. So you're teaching from the first all the way down, forward chain. A backward chain is kind of what you think it is, where you teach the very last skill first. In other words, you take the learner, you prompt them through, you guide them through, you can do all the skills for them until the very last step. There's where you teach. So let's say, for example, we were doing hand washing, and the last step that we targeted was throwing a paper towel in the garbage. You would take the learner through all the steps using the amount necessary, prompting necessary. And then you would teach them throwing it in the garbage. When they're able to throw independently in the garbage, you would then go backwards. So now it might be dry, or it might be crumpling up the tissue, and then throwing it in. When they met criteria on that, it might be drying their hands, crumpling it up, and throwing it in the garbage. After that, it might be rinsing hands, drying hands, crumpling up, throwing it in the garbage. So what you do is you kind of work backwards. A third way is known as total task presentation, which is you teach on every step of the skill as necessary for the learner. So in other words, you would start from 1 all the way down, and what you're doing is you're providing help or guidance along each step of the chain as needed for your learner. Now, of the 3 methodologies, I can tell you in my history, in my clinical practice, in the way I do it, I have a tendency to like total task presentation. There's just something about it that I like. I find it to be as effective. I like the fact that I'm making these moment-to-moment, a few things. 1, I'm taking the learner through all the steps. I'm making the learner an active member, if you will, an active participant in the whole process. And it gives me moment-to-moment feedback on where along the chain or the skill set that they might need help. And what I'm doing is I'm adjusting accordingly every day. So I have a tendency to like that. When we do toilet training, I typically will recommend a total task presentation. So that's just my saying. Do you guys have anything else to add on that?
No, I think you did a great job covering all of them, Jimmy. Thank you very much.
Well,
Actually, in reference to that, Jimmy said that he prefers using a total task. And in my experience, I've always used a backwards chain to teach most skills, depending on the learners I was working with, but it always kind of aligned with that. So I think it's worth noting that it's never the same for any clinician, for any learner. And you kind of just do what works for you, depending on how you're teaching it.
right. In addition, as you're teaching through the chain, we would we would refer you guys back to our previous newsletter on prompting. So as you're helping the individual at the current step, we would use all those types of prompting methodology specific to your learner. Is it a visual prompt? Is it a vocal prompt? Is it a modeling prompt? Or is it some type of physical guidance? And you would use the exact same types of prompting and fading techniques as we had discussed in a previous newsletter.
Yep, exactly.
Nice, you want to
All
finish
right,
up?
guys. Sure. So here are some tips of the week. First, you're going to think about the concept of behavior training and the method that you're going to use. Determine the area of importance. Come up with a task analysis. Pick your method for teaching. Ensure that you reach out to all of your related services and resources, and enjoy the process. Here's a quote from Benjamin Franklin: "Teach me and I'll forget, show me and I may remember, involve me and I'll learn."
I
And I
think
think that resonates with a lot of us, or all of us.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we hope that, we're trying to end that quote, this is our 10th newsletter. And we hope that that quote not only provides kind of a summary of chaining, but overall the purposes of all these newsletters. The purpose of these newsletters was to kind of inform you, but also involve you in that whole process. And we hope, that we can continue to do that. Also, it is our 10th newsletter, and I just want to put it out there that this will be Marissa's last newsletter.
It is.
And I just wanted to take this opportunity just to really thank her and tell her how much we're going to miss her. And I wanted to end on that quote because what I think we've all learned from Marissa is that she has been so involved in all this process. So it's bittersweet that we're ending it on 10. We hope that maybe someday she'll come in for some more guest spots. But I did want to take this opportunity just to kind of personally thank her for putting together all these newsletters and all her help, since I've been working with her. So I just wanted to put it out there. We'd actually originally taped this, but I said I messed it up, but I really didn't. I wanted to retape it because I wanted to just thank her and just tell her how significant she's been through this whole process. So,
Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa.
I appreciate that so much. I'm going to try really hard not to.
Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you guys so much.
So I'll let you take us out. So I'm Jimmy O'Brien.
And I'm Marissa Eck, and I'm trying not to cry.
You didn't let's try that again. So you'll go last. I'm Jimmy O'Brien.
Aisha Lee.
Finish it up.
Thank you so much.
Bye, guys. Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, Marissa.